I have lived in Bishop's Notch for almost 40 years now, and in that time I have watched a great many people pass through. Some I remember, most I don't. But there is one winter I will carry with me until they put me in the ground, and it is not because of the snow, though God knows that was the worst snow any of us had seen. It is because of a man who never told me his name, and a woman who I thought, for one long night, was going to die in my doorway with her baby in her arms. Let me tell it the way it happened. Bishop's Notch sits in a fold of the high country where the road narrows down between two shoulders of rock before it climbs over the pass. There's not much to it. There never was. A church that the wind half tore the roof off of twice, a blacksmith, a store with a few rooms above it for travelers which my husband built and which I ran after he passed. People came through on their way to somewhere better. We fed them, took their coin, and waved them off. That was the whole of our lives. In the deep of that December, the cold came down off the mountains like something with a grudge. I don't know how to describe it to you if you've never felt cold like that. It wasn't weather. It was a thing that got inside the walls. The nails in the boards would go white with frost. You'd wake in the night and your breath would be hanging over the bed like a little ghost. The men stopped going out except to bring in wood and water, and even then they came back gray in the face, stamping and cursing and rubbing their hands. The stage was 3 days late. When it finally came down the pass, I heard the bells before I saw it, muffled and slow, the horses blowing great clouds of steam. The driver, a man named Ferris that I'd known for years, all but fell off the box. His beard was a single sheet of ice. He could hardly speak. He told me later he'd nearly turned back twice, but there was a woman inside who begged him not to. I went out to help, the way I always did, and I opened that coach door. And there she was. She was young, younger than I'd thought from her voice when she finally spoke. Her shawl was wrapped around and around her, and inside the bundle of it she had a baby, and the baby was so still that for one awful second I thought she was carrying a dead child down out of the mountains. Her lips had no color in them at all. Her eyes found mine and there was no panic in them, which somehow frightened me more than panic would have. It was the look of someone who has been afraid for so long that the fear has burned itself down to nothing. "Please," she said. "That was all, just please." I got her inside. Ferris helped, what little he could. We sat her by the stove and I peeled that frozen shawl off her and the baby came out of it pink and breathing, thank God, but breathing fast and shallow, the way a sick child does. The mother, her name was Ruth, I learned later, though that night she could hardly tell me anything. Ruth held that little one against her chest and rocked and would not let me take her even to warm her properly. Now I want to tell you something true about people, because this story is mostly about people, and not all of it is kind. The store was full that night. The cold had driven half the town in to sit by the stove and drink coffee and complain. There were maybe a dozen men and a few wives in there when I brought that mother in. And I will tell you, when those people saw a stranger woman with a sick baby, half frozen, with no man and no money to speak of, something closed in their faces. You'd think it would have gone the other way. You'd think a sick baby would soften a room. It did not. It hardened it. Because here is the thing nobody likes to say out loud. A sick stranger is a problem. A sick stranger with a baby is a problem that might land on you, might cost you, might keep you up at night and ask things of you that you didn't plan to give. And folks in a hard winter are already giving everything they have just to stay alive, and they have nothing left over, and what they don't have they protect with a kind of meanness that I have never quite forgiven and never quite forgotten. The first thing was the rooms. I had 2 rooms above the store. One was let to a drummer, a salesman who'd been snowed in for a week and was paying me well to be there. The other I kept for the stage passengers. I told Ruth she could have it. I meant it. But the price of a room in that weather, with the wood it took to keep one warm, was more than that girl had in the whole world. She turned out her little purse on my counter and there were a few coins in it and that was all. She didn't beg. She just looked at the coins like they'd betrayed her, and she nodded, like this too was a thing she had expected. "It's all right. I started to say, because I'd have given her the room for free, I would have. But the drummer spoke up from across the room. He said, loud enough for everyone, that he hoped I wasn't going to put a sick child in the room next to his, with him paying full fare, because whatever that baby had, he didn't want to catch it carrying it back down the line. And do you know, a couple of the others muttered along with him. A man named Crail, who ran the smithy and thought a great deal of himself, said it wasn't right to take in just anybody off the road. Said the town wasn't a charity. Said if we started letting every drifting woman with a sad story sleep by our fires, we'd be overrun by spring. I said the baby was sick. He said that wasn't his lookout. And the room, I am ashamed to say this even now, the room got quiet, and in the quiet I understood that not one of those people was going to do a single thing. Ruth had stopped trying. She'd gathered the baby up and she sat there on the bench by the stove and she'd made herself small, the way a person does when they've learned that being seen only brings them trouble. She wasn't crying. I think she was past it. The baby made a sound, not a cry, a thin little sound, worse than a cry, and Ruth held her tighter and looked at the floor. That was when I noticed the man in the corner. I hadn't paid him any mind before. He'd come in maybe an hour ahead of the stage out of the dark and ordered coffee and sat in the corner away from the lamp, and he'd said nothing to anyone. We knew of him, the way you know of a thing more than you know it. He lived up past the pass, high up alone, in country that no one in their right mind wintered in. He came down maybe twice a year for salt and powder, and the few things a man can't make for himself. Nobody knew where he'd come from. Nobody knew his Christian name. The few times anyone had spoken to him, he'd answered in as few words as a man could and still be understood. Folks called him different things behind his back. A hermit, a madman. Some said he'd done something terrible once, far away, and come up here to get away from the memory of it. I never knew if any of that was true. I called him by the name the trappers used, which was Cobb, and I don't to this day know if that was his name or just a sound men had hung on him. He was a big man, not loud big, the kind of big that takes up no more space than it has to. His hands, when he wrapped them around that coffee cup, looked like they could have crushed it without trying. He had a beard going gray and a face you couldn't read at all. He'd been sitting through all of it, the drummer and Crail and the muttering, with his eyes down on his cup. And then, very slowly, he looked up. He didn't look at the men. He looked at the mother. He looked at her for a long moment and then at the baby, and I watched his face and I still couldn't read it, but something in the room changed when he raised his head. The way the air changes before weather. He set his cup down. The little click of it against the wood was the loudest thing in that room. And he stood up. When Cobb stood, the whole place felt it, though he never said a word. He crossed the room, not fast. Men got out of his way without seeming to decide to. He stopped in front of Ruth, and that poor girl flinched, because by then any movement toward her had meant something bad. She pulled the baby in. He went down on one knee in front of her. I'd never seen him do a soft thing in all the years I'd known of him. But he went down on that knee, slow, the way you'd kneel by something you didn't want to frighten, and he put out one of those great hands, not toward her, but palm up open between them. An offer, like you'd hold a hand out to a dog that's been kicked. She looked at the hand, then at his face. He still didn't speak, but he nodded once toward the baby, and there was a question in it that needed no words. May I? I don't know what she saw in him. Maybe she was past being able to choose. Maybe she saw the one thing in that room that hadn't already turned away from her, but she loosened her arms and she let him take the child. He took that baby into his hands like she was made of something he might break with a breath. He laid her along one forearm, the whole of her fit there, and he put the back of 2 fingers against her cheek and her throat, and he was still for a moment, feeling the way a doctor would. And his face changed. Just a little. Just enough that I, who'd known of him for years and never seen anything cross that face, saw it cross now. The baby had a fever, a high one. You could feel the heat coming off her, and the cold she'd been packed in had been the only thing keeping it from running away with her entirely. Now that she was warming up by the stove, the fever was climbing. Cobb stood with the baby on his arm. He looked around the room slow, taking in every face. The drummer, Crail, the wives who'd looked away. He didn't say a thing. He didn't have to. There is a kind of silence that is louder than any shouting, and that was the silence he laid on that room. He looked at each of them, and each of them, one by one, found somewhere else to put their eyes. Then he looked at me. "Water," he said, first word out of him. "Boiling, and the cleanest cloth you have." I moved. Lord, I moved fast. It was a relief to be told what to do. He carried the baby and the mother both into the back, into my own kitchen, where the big stove was, and he set the woman in the warm chair and he laid the child across her lap, and he began, with no fuss, to do the things that needed doing. I have thought a great deal in the years since about how he knew, where a man who lived alone in the high country learned to bring a fever down in a baby, whether he'd had a child once somewhere before, whatever it was that drove him up the mountain. He never said, and I never asked, but his hands knew. He had me wet the cloths in cool water, not cold. He was particular about that, cool, and he showed Ruth how to lay them along the baby's neck and the soft of her arms and her little legs, and how to keep changing them as they took the heat. He had me brew something from a twist of dried leaves he carried in his coat, willow bark and something else I didn't know, and we got a few drops of it past the baby's lips with a spoon. And all the while he barely spoke. He'd touch the baby's chest and say, again. He'd feel her cheek and say, cooler. He moved that big body around my little kitchen quiet as a cat. And Ruth, who hadn't trusted a soul in I don't know how long, did everything he showed her, and the two of them worked over that child without a wasted motion, and I just kept the water and the cloths coming and tried to stay out of the way. It was a long night. There was an hour somewhere in the worst of the dark, when the wind was screaming around the eaves and the cold was pressing on the glass like it wanted in, when the baby went very still and her breathing got so shallow you had to put your face right down to feel it. Ruth made a sound I never want to hear again. And Cobb, for the first time, looked afraid. Not for himself. I don't think that man feared a thing on this earth for himself. He looked afraid the way you do when there's a thing you want with your whole heart, and it's slipping past where your hands can reach. He took the baby up. He held her against his own chest, against the warmth of him, and he wrapped his coat around the both of them, and he stood in the middle of my kitchen and he rocked, this enormous silent man, rocking a stranger's baby in the dead of a killing winter. And he bent his head down close to her, and I heard him only just saying something to her, too low for me to catch the words. Not loud, not a prayer exactly. Just words going into her ear, steady, on and on, the way you'd talk a frightened horse down off a panic. Telling her, I think, to stay. Just telling her to stay. I don't know how long that went on. The candle burned down. The fire ate through half my winter's wood, and I fed it anyway and would have burned the furniture if he'd asked. And then the baby coughed. It was a small thing, a wet, ugly little cough. But Cobb's head came up and Ruth was on her feet and the baby coughed again and turned her face and started, weakly, to cry. A real cry. A cross, hungry, alive cry. I have heard a lot of pretty sounds in my life. Church bells. A good fiddle. None of them ever sounded as sweet to me as that miserable baby crying in my kitchen. The fever had broken. Ruth took her child and sat down hard, like her legs had quit, and she pressed her face into that baby and finally she cried herself, great racking sobs, all the fear of all those days coming out of her at once. And Cobb stepped back. He stepped back the way a man does when his work is done and he doesn't want any thanks for it. He went to the corner of the kitchen and he leaned against the wall and he closed his eyes, and I saw how tired he was. How he'd been holding himself up by will alone for hours, and I thought, this is the most a person can do for another person. This right here. And he did it for a woman whose name he didn't know. Toward dawn the wind began to ease. The town found out, of course. A town like Bishop's Notch keeps no secrets. By the next afternoon, the story had gone all the way around. How the stranger woman's baby had taken sick and like to died, and how not one respectable soul in town would lift a hand, and how it was Cobb, the hermit from the high country, the one they'd all called mad, who'd come down off his stool and saved the child's life with his own two hands while the rest of them sat on theirs. You should have seen them after that. Suddenly everyone had always meant to help. Crail came by with a side of bacon for the young mother, all puffed up like it had been his idea. The drummer found urgent business down the line and left on the first stage out, and I was glad to see the back of him. The wives who'd looked away came around with broth and a knitted cap for the baby and a great deal of talk about how terrible it had all been, how worried they'd been the whole time. I let them leave their things. The girl could use them, but I noticed not one of them could quite look me in the eye while they said it, and I let them feel that too. I am not a saint. I let them feel it. Ruth stayed with me a week, until the baby was strong and the pass was clear enough to travel. I learned her story in bits, the way you learn anything from a person who's been hurt. Her man had died. There'd been some trouble after, some family that didn't want her, and she'd been going to a sister 2 valleys over who might or might not take her in. She had nothing and no one and a baby in the dead of winter, and she put herself on that stage and prayed. I asked her once if she was frightened, going on alone. She said she'd been frightened her whole life, but she said it different now. She said it like a thing she'd decided she could carry. As for Cobb, he was gone before the sun was fully up that first morning. I came down to start the fire and the kitchen was empty and the back door was unlatched and his coffee cup was rinsed and set upside down to dry on the board, which was such a small, careful thing for a man like that to do that it has stayed with me all these years. He hadn't waited for thanks. He hadn't waited for the town to make a hero of him, which they tried to after, the way people do when it costs them nothing. He'd done the thing that needed doing, and then he'd gone back up his mountain into the cold and the quiet that he seemed to need more than he needed any of us. He left one thing. On the table by the upside-down cup, he'd set the little twist of leaves, the willow bark, the rest of it, the medicine he'd carried in his coat. He'd left it for the baby in case the fever came back. He couldn't have known if it would. He left it anyway. The whole of what he had, against a thing that might never come. Ruth never got to thank him. She wanted to. She asked me before she left how she might get word up the mountain to the man who saved her daughter. I told her the truth, which was that you didn't get word to Cobb. He came down when he came down, and the rest of the time the mountain had him. But I'll tell you what she did. She named the baby. The child hadn't a proper name yet. There'd been no time, no peace, no christening in all that running. And before Ruth went on over the past to her uncertain sister and her uncertain life, she had the child's name set down in the church book. She didn't name her after herself, or after her dead husband, or after any saint. She wrote down a name that wasn't a name, really. She wrote down the only name the man had ever gone by, the trapper's name, the sound men had hung on him. She gave her daughter his name. I saw Cobb maybe 4 or 5 times more over the years when he came down for his salt and his powder. He never spoke of that winter. I don't think he ever knew about the name. I thought about telling him more than once. But there was something in the way he kept himself apart that made me feel it wasn't mine to give him, so I never did. I just gave him his coffee in the corner away from the lamp, the way he liked it, and once, only once, I put my hand over his on the counter just for a second, and he let me, and then I took it back and we never spoke of that either. He's gone now. The mountain has him for good. One spring he didn't come down and the next he didn't either, and that was that. No one went up to look. There'd have been no point, and I think he'd have hated it. People ask me sometimes, the younger ones, why I keep the store going when my knees are bad and the town's half empty and I could go live easy with my sister's people down in the valley. And I tell them I'm waiting on the stage, which is a joke mostly. The stage hasn't run in years. But here is the true reason, and I'll give it to you the way I've never given it to them. I have learned that you can stand in a warm room full of decent people and watch a soul freeze at the edge of it, and most everyone will find a reason to look away. That's the easy thing. That's the thing the cold teaches you to do. And I learned that winter that the difference between a good man and the rest of us is not in what he says, because the best one I ever knew hardly said a word. It's in whether he stands up. So I keep the door unlatched, and I keep the fire going. And when somebody comes in out of the dark, half frozen, with nothing and no one and a sad story nobody wants to hear, I think of a big silent man going down on one knee in front of a frightened girl, holding out an open hand. And I stand up,